Hey everybody, welcome, welcome to Hidden Horror. Thank you for spending this time with me. I appreciate that. Let's get started.
I apologize. Good morning, everybody. Happy Saturday. Welcome to Hidden Horror. How are you guys doing today on a Saturday morning? I hope all is well with you. I'm doing pretty good besides my allergies. My eyes are a little watery, nose is a little stuffy, but I'm feeling okay. So, today I'm here. I want to talk about something that was revealed in a motion that was filed by the defense. Bryan Kohberger, he may have autism spectrum disorder. It's called ASD. And I'm here this morning. I want to talk about it. I want to know, well, what is autism spectrum disorder? How would that impact any person, including Bryan Kohberger? What would we see? What are some of the behaviors? How do you get something like autism spectrum disorder? Is it from genetics, from your parents? Is it something that's a trait within the family tree? I don't know. I didn't know much about it. So I was very interested to find out. And I want to share that information with you because how does that impact the Idaho 4 case? These very four vicious murders. Um, Kaylee, Maddie, Ethan, and Zaina brutally killed in 2022. And Mr. Kohberger is the assailant that allegedly committed these heinous murders. Okay. So we want to talk about that. We want to talk about, is there a place where a person would not be facing the death penalty because of this, right? Is this a cruel and unusual punishment if someone has this disorder, this mental disability? Let's talk about it all. So we're going to get started. I have one video, I have an article, and then I have the article that's going to tie it all in relating to Bryan Kohberger. But first, we're going to lay the foundation for what is autism spectrum disorder, abbreviated ASD. Now, if you go to the Hidden Horror Facebook page, you will see the links to the articles and the video. You can refer back to it, you can read it later. Now, the article is long, but I'm not going to read every part of it because it all really doesn't apply, but you can take the time and read it all. I'm going to go over most of it though. Okay, so the article is coming from the mayoclinic.org. Okay, and it doesn't have a date. It's on their website, so it's just going to tell us, an overview, some medical knowledge about it, some symptoms of it. How can you prevent it? Well, you can't prevent this particular um, disease, but those are the type of things that you can find out on the mayoclinic.org website. Okay, so let's get started. Going to lay the foundation first. Autism spectrum disorder is a condition related to brain development that impacts how a person perceives and socializes with others, causing problems in social interaction and communication. So it's the part of your brain that develops and it helps you in your interactions, your socialization with others. How do you respond in situations? What is your behavior like? Are you isolated? Do you like to be by yourself? Or are you more outgoing? Do you interact with others? Are you able to maintain conversations? These are all types of behaviors, right? That's important. And when you're developing, your brain is developing and you learn certain skills. But if a person has this autism spectrum disorder, it's going to indicate that maybe they don't have all the skills when their brain is developing. So they're going to have some areas where they're not fully functioning, okay? The disorder also includes limited and repetitive patterns of behavior. The term spectrum in autism spectrum disorder refers to the wide range of symptoms and severity. So this means that you can have a spectrum. Say you go from numbers 1 to 5. Maybe 1 is the least severe. And as that number rises, the behaviors will also rise. Maybe at level 1, you can communicate, you can hold conversations, you can be very highly functioning. But as you go from 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, those abilities, those skills, those fine motor skills, it could diminish, right? And that's what they're going to talk about more, okay? Especially in the video. The video is an excellent video, okay? Let's continue. Autism spectrum disorder includes conditions that were previously considered separate. Autism, Asperger's syndrome, childhood disintegrative disorder, and an unspecified form of pervasive development disorder. Some people still use the term Asperger's syndrome, which is generally thought to be at the mild end of autism spectrum disorder. So again, if you have, for example, the numbers 1 through 5, and 1 is the least severe, they're placing Asperger's disorder about at a 1, okay? So that means this person will be functionable. They might be highly functionable, be able to communicate, have some socialization skills, talking, communicating, being around people, but they may have some traits. For example, they may want to isolate. They may want to be alone. They may not be able to hold conversations. Maybe their behaviors in public may not be normal, may not be typical, okay? But we're going to go over it all. Excuse me for the sniffling. It's really my allergies. Let's continue. Autism spectrum disorder begins in early childhood and eventually causes problems functioning in society, socially, in school, and at work, for example. Often, children show symptoms of autism within the first year. A small number of children appear to develop normally in the first year and then go through a period of regression between 18 and 24 months of age when they develop autism symptoms. While there is no cure for autism spectrum disorder, intensive early treatment can make a big difference in the lives of many children. Now, if this is starting very young, it is helpful if you can identify it. You can possibly get that person some help early on, right? Let's continue. Some children show signs of autism spectrum disorder in early infancy, such as reduced eye contact, lack of response to their name, or indifference to caregivers. Other children may develop normally for the first few months or years of life, but then suddenly become withdrawn or aggressive or lose language skills they've already acquired. Signs usually are seen by age 2 years old. Each child with autism spectrum disorder is likely to have a unique pattern of behavior and level of severity from low functioning to high functioning. Some children with autism spectrum disorder have difficulty learning, and some have signs of lower than normal intelligence. Other children with the disorder have normal to high intelligence. They learn quickly, yet have trouble communicating and applying what they know in everyday life and adjusting to social situations. So some may learn very slowly. Some may have normal intelligence, and then some may have high intelligence, but they're not able to apply what they learn. They're not able to communicate, and they're going to have some issues when they get into social settings. Okay. Because of the unique mixture of symptoms in each child, severity can sometimes be difficult to determine. It's generally based on the level of impairments and how they impact the ability to function. Below are some common signs shown by people who have autism spectrum disorder. A child or adult with autism spectrum disorder may have problems with social interaction and communication skills, including any of these signs. They fail to respond to his or her name or appear not to hear you at times. They resist cuddling and holding and seems to prefer playing alone, retreating into his or her own world. Has poor eye contact and lacks facial expression. Doesn't speak or has delayed speech or loses previous ability to say words or sentences. They can't start a conversation or keep one going, or only starts one to make requests or label items. Speaks with an abnormal tone or rhythm and may use a sing-song voice or robot-like speech. Repeats words or phrases verbatim, but doesn't understand how to use them. Doesn't appear to understand simple questions or directions. Doesn't express emotions or feelings and appears unaware of others' feelings. Doesn't point out, doesn't point at or bring objects to share interests. Inappropriately approaches a social interaction by being passive, aggressive, or disruptive. Has difficulty recognizing nonverbal cues such as interpreting other people's facial expressions, body postures, or tone of voice. A child or an adult with autism spectrum disorder may have limited, repetitive patterns of behavior, interests, or activities, including any of these signs. Performs repetitive movements such as rocking, spinning, or hand flapping. Performs activities that could cause self harm, such as biting or head banging. Develops specific routines or rituals and becomes disturbed at the slightest change. Has problems with coordination or has odd movement patterns such as clumsiness or walking on toes, and has odd, stiff, or exaggerated body language. Is fascinated by details of an object such as the spinning wheels of a toy car, but doesn't understand the overall purpose or function of the object. Is unusually sensitive to light, sound, or touch, yet may be indifferent to pain or temperature. Doesn't engage in imitative or make believe play. Fixates on an object or activity with abnormal intensity or focus. Has specific food preferences, such as eating only a few foods or refusing foods with a certain texture. As they mature, some children with autism spectrum disorder become more engaged with others and show fewer disturbances in behavior. Some, usually those with the least severe problems, eventually may lead normal or near normal lives. Others, however, continue to have difficulty with language or social skills, and the teen years can bring worse behavioral and emotional problems. Autism spectrum disorder has no single known cause. Given the complexity of the disorder and the fact that symptoms and severity vary, there are probably many causes. Both genetics and environment may play a role. So I'm skipping through a little bit. I'm going to go a little bit over the risk factors, okay? The number of children diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder is rising. It's not clear whether this is due to better detection and reporting or a real increase in the number of cases or both. Autism spectrum disorder affects children of all races and nationalities, but certain factors increase a child's risk. These may include your child's sex. Boys are about 4 times more likely to develop autism spectrum disorder than girls are. Families who have one child with autism spectrum disorder have an increased risk of having another child with the disorder. It's also not uncommon for parents or relatives of a child, with autism spectrum disorder to have minor problems with social or communication skills themselves or to engage in certain behaviors typical of the disorder. Children with certain medical conditions have a higher than normal risk of autism spectrum disorder or autism-like symptoms. Examples include Fragile X syndrome, an inherited disorder that causes intellectual problems, tuberous sclerosis, a condition in which benign tumors develop in the brain, and Rett syndrome, a genetic condition occurring almost exclusively in girls, which causes slowing of head growth, intellectual disability, and loss of purposeful hand use. Babies born before 26 weeks of gestation may have a greater risk of autism spectrum disorder. There may be a connection between children born to older parents and autism spectrum disorder, but more research is necessary to establish this link. Problems with social interactions, communications, and behavior can lead to problems in school and with successful learning, employment problems, inability to live independently, social isolation, stress within the family, victimization, and being bullied. There's no way to prevent autism spectrum disorder, but there are treatment options. Early diagnosis and intervention is most helpful and can improve behavior, skills, and language development. However, intervention is helpful at any age. Though children usually don't outgrow autism spectrum disorder symptoms, they may learn to function well. So I only skipped over a little bit. It's an excellent read. I encourage you to read the pieces that I didn't read and to go over it all, because if you think about the Idaho 4 case and who they have arrested as the assailant, Bryan Kohberger, you may be able to identify some of the characteristics, the behaviors that he exudes, okay? I'm not going to make any kind of diagnosis or anything like that, because I'm not qualified to, but let's go over, I want to share this video that's going to basically show you and describe it, and you can kind of gain a different perspective about it, okay? It's a very good video that I'm going to share about autism spectrum disorder. So, okay, so this video is by Medscape. The title is Autism Spectrum Disorder, and it's a clinical presentation, and it's about 7.5 minutes long. So let's check out the video now.
Even though everyone develops at slightly different paces, almost everyone hits the same general developmental milestones and learns the same sets of skills at about the same time, more or less. These are things like language and communication, socializing, cognitive skills like problem solving, and physical milestones like walking, crawling, and fine motor skills, all of which progress as the brain develops. If one of these doesn't develop as scheduled, depending on the severity, it may be described as a type of neurodevelopmental disorder, neuro referring to the brain. Especially when certain skills related to socializing and communicating don't proceed as normally, it can result in isolation, which is where the name autism originated, since auto means self. So, autism refers to a condition where somebody might be removed from social interaction and communication, leaving them alone or isolated. Before 2013, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Disorders, the 4th edition, or the DSM-4, described autism as one of several pervasive developmental disorders, which also includes Asperger's syndrome, childhood disintegrative disorder, and those not otherwise specified, or PDD and OS. Asperger's syndrome was used for children that appeared to have characteristics of autism, like difficulties with social interactions or nonverbal communication, but don't generally have significant delays in language or cognitive development. And therefore, Asperger's syndrome was sometimes referred to as a high-functioning form of autism. Childhood disintegrative disorder was used to describe late onset of developmental delays. So these children develop normally for their age, but then they seem to lose the acquired social and communication skills sometime between age 2 and 10. Pervasive developmental disorder, not otherwise specified, is essentially a catch-all category in which patients meet some, but not all features of autism, Asperger's syndrome, or childhood disintegrative disorder. Researchers found, however, that separate diagnoses of these pervasive developmental disorders weren't consistent across different clinics, since they tend to have very similar signs and symptoms. As of 2013, the DSM-5, a new revised edition, removed these terms and replaced them with Autism Spectrum Disorder, or ASD, which encompasses all of the previous pervasive developmental disorders, but uses a scale or a spectrum that differentiates based on the severity of two major areas: social communication and interaction deficits, and restrictive or repetitive behavior, interests, and activities. For the social and communication area, there are 4 subcategories that clinicians look for deficits. The first is social reciprocity, which refers to how children respond or reciprocate in social interactions. So like how the behavior of one person influences the other, and vice versa. An example impairment in this area might be referring to being alone and not taking a role in social games. A second area of potential deficit is joint attention, which is the state of wanting to share an interest with someone else. So it's like, hey, check out this awesome thing I found. So an example impairment in this area might be a child not sharing their interests or amusement in an object with their parent. Next, there's nonverbal communication, which refers to difficulties either using nonverbal communication themselves or interpreting nonverbal cues from someone else. So maybe the child won't put their arms out when they want to be picked up, or maybe they won't be able to tell when a parent's upset, even if the parent's frowning and crossing their arms. The last subcategory of communication deficits is in social relationships. So children have trouble developing and maintaining relationships. So maybe the child has a hard time making friends, or they're able to make friends, but their behavior tends to drive the friends away. The other major area is called restrictive and repetitive behaviors. And this category is pretty broad and can include a whole bunch of behaviors, some being more well known or characterized than others, like lining up toys in a ritualistic sort of way, or flapping one's hands, or imitating words or phrases. The child might be fixed on certain routines, like taking the same route every day to school, or they might have restricted patterns of interest, like having a very specific and in-depth knowledge of the Titanic or vacuum cleaners. Children with autism spectrum disorder might exhibit one or more of these deficits and vary in how severe the deficit is. With that in mind, it's important to remember that each child with autism spectrum disorder is going to have a different spectrum of symptoms and deficits. Typically, clinicians will try to observe these behaviors in the child, looking for these possible deficits. Since these behaviors are often more well known by the child's caretakers than they are by the clinicians, like their parents or their teachers, a meaningful diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder relies heavily on listening to what others are observing at home or in school. They might be given severity scores in each area, which can help determine how much support the child's going to need, For example, a severity level 1 would indicate the child needs some support. For social communication, they might speak in full sentences and engage in communication, but normal back and forth conversation with others just doesn't seem to work. For repetitive and restrictive behaviors, they might have difficulty switching between activities. On the other side of the spectrum, a level 3 severity means the child needs very substantial support. And on the social communication side, they might display very few words of intelligible speech and rarely initiate an interaction with others. For repetitive behaviors, they might be extremely resistant to change, and their behaviors seriously interfere with their daily life. It's thought that using this scale of symptoms, as opposed to differentiating between pervasive developmental disorders, will help give a more accurate and medically useful way to diagnose individuals. For example, those with what was previously described as Asperger's syndrome would likely fall closer to severity level 1 than severity level 3. Generally speaking, autism spectrum disorder is thought to have a genetic cause, which ultimately affects brain development, specifically areas that affect social and communication behaviors. Which genes or combination of genes that are affected in autism spectrum disorder, though, is still very much a mystery. In addition, there are a bunch of environmental triggers that have to be explored, but at the moment, there are no clear risk factors that have been identified. With that said, there is also no cure for autism spectrum disorder, and treatment or management has to be specifically and carefully tailored to each child. And this includes things like specialized education programs and behavior therapy that all seek to maximize quality of life and functional independence.
Okay, so I really feel like that was a very good video. It really spoke to it and kind of demonstrated in a way that you can clearly see the differences, the behaviors, how some are social, some are from communication, but they both impact the person due to how their brain is developing, right? So I'm going to now relate this to the Idaho 4 and really specifically Bryan Kohberger, the arrested alleged assailant of the killings of the Idaho 4 students. Okay, so I'm going to go over an article. It's by CNN.com. And this is going to be specifically about Bryan Kohberger. So I'm going to put a picture of him up. So I'm going to share my screen now. Just have an image of him because I'm talking specifically about him. The article is titled New Details About Idaho Student Killing Suspect Bryan Kohberger Revealed in Unsealed Court Filing. The article is dated March 6, 2025, and is by Rebecca Reese. A recently unsealed defense motion in the capital murder case against Bryan Kohberger offers the most detailed picture of the suspect's personality to emerge since his arrest in the brutal killings of 4 University Idaho students. Attorneys for Kohberger claim in the motion the 30-year-old has autism spectrum disorder, or ASD, and executing him would violate the Eighth Amendment's prohibition on cruel and unusual punishment. Kohberger displays extremely rigid thinking, perseveres on specific topics, processes information on a piecemeal basis, struggles to plan ahead, and demonstrates little insight into his own behaviors and emotions, the filing notes, citing a medical evaluation commissioned by his attorneys. Due to his ASD, Mr. Kohberger simply cannot comport himself in a manner that aligns with societal expectations of normalcy. This creates an unconscionable risk that he will be executed because of his disability rather than his culpability, his attorneys said. So, what they're trying to say is instead of him being convicted because he actually did these crimes, these four murders, he may be convicted on what people are perceiving in his behaviors, his attitude, because really, in fact, he has this mental disability and he's going to have issues demonstrating in a normal way, a typical way that you would expect. Because he have these issues, these social issues, these communication issues that we just went over in the video and then in the article, okay? Kohberger is accused of killing Madison Mogen, Kaylee Goncalves, Zana Connerto, and Ethan Chapin at an off-campus home in November 22. Not guilty pleas have been entered on his behalf. The newly unsealed filing is the latest in a flurry of defense motions aimed at taking the death penalty off the table for the only suspect in the fatal stabbings that horrified the small college community of Moscow. The investigation culminated with the arrest in Pennsylvania of Kohberger, a criminology graduate student. The U.S. Supreme Court has declined to hear previous arguments by capital defendants seeking to use some developmental disorders, including autism spectrum disorder, to argue against the death penalty, a legal expert told CNN. It's unclear if or when Kohberger was previously diagnosed with ASD, but the new filing cites an evaluation by a neuropsychologist who found Kohberger continues to exhibit all the core diagnostic features of ASD currently, with significant impact on his daily life. The neuropsychologist hired by his defense wrote in her evaluation of Kohberger that he displayed deficits in social, emotional reciprocity, and impulsive tendencies, including compulsions around hand washing and other cleaning behaviors, the filing says. In the filing, attorneys for Kohberger describe him as a highly distractible man with an intense gaze who demonstrates little insight into his own behaviors and emotions, citing the medical evaluation performed by Dr. Rachel Orr. Previous Supreme Court rulings have determined youth and intellectual disability create an unacceptable risk of wrongful execution because they hamper the defendant's ability to present mitigation evidence, Kohberger's attorney said. Likening ASD to an intellectual disability, they argue such defendants are unable to make a persuasive showing of mitigation in the face of prosecutorial evidence. While the evaluation found that Kohberger possessed strong verbal abilities, his language was often over-inclusive, disorganized, highly repetitive, and overly formal, and he was highly distractible, the filing said. Kohberger was a graduate student at Washington State University's Department of Criminal Justice and Criminology and had finished his first semester as a PhD student in the school's criminal justice program in December of 2023, CNN previously reported. Kohberger subtly rocks his upper torso, especially while engaged in a cognitive task or listening to someone else, and exhibits atypical eye contact, including an intense gaze, the neuropsychologist observed, according to the filing. His facial expressions, including a concentrated gaze, are already being assigned sinister meaning by observers, Kohberger's attorney claimed, citing media coverage ahead of the trial. An Idaho judge already agreed to move the trial venue, citing media coverage of the case and concerns that the local community is prejudiced against the suspect. A jury in this case will be emotionally overwhelmed by the factual allegations and simultaneously looking at a defendant who appears to be emotionally uninvested and unmoved and who cannot persuasively testify in his own defense, amounting to an unconstitutional risk that Mr. Kohberger, on account of his disability, will be unreliably convicted and sentenced to death, the motion states. So clearly right there, he's not going to testify. That's what is apparent, that Bryan Kohberger is not going to testify, okay? Kohberger's lawyers filed a myriad of motions last year listing reasons they believe the state's intent to seek the death penalty is unconstitutional. One focused on what Kohberger's defense team calls an ideological shift and evolving standards in the way Americans view the death penalty. Other motions argue Idaho's death penalty statute constitutes a violation of international law and the fundamental precepts of international human rights. The motion unsealed this week also follows his defense team's failed attempt to convince a judge to suppress evidence related to investigative genetic genealogy, a relatively new technique authorities use to upload an unknown suspect's DNA profile to a database in a bid to identify potential relatives. In a motion filed last Monday, the defense again asked the DNA evidence in the case be kept from the jury in the trial because jurors could believe the DNA gathered by prosecutors is Kohberger's, and according to the defense, it is not. Kohberger's attorneys, led by Ann Taylor, also point in the new filing to the Supreme Court's prohibition on the death penalty in cases where a defendant has any characteristic that renders him less culpable, negates the retributive and deterrent aims of capital punishment, or creates a risk of an erroneous death sentence. They argue this applies to defendants with autism spectrum disorder. ASD is a neurological and developmental disorder that can affect how people interact with others, communicate, learn, and behave, according to the National Institute of Mental Health. People with ASD, including Mr. Kohberger, exhibit deficits in nearly all the same areas cited by the court in concluding that it is unconstitutional for people with intellectual disabilities to be sentenced to death because such sentences are not proportional and cannot be reliably imposed, the new motion states. A diagnosis of an autism spectrum disorder is as relevant to police and legal proceedings as a diagnosis of mental retardation or mental illness would be, no matter how bright, high functioning, and or verbal the person may be. Nonprofit advocacy group Autism Speak said in a resource page on the judicial system. Likening ASD to an intellectual disability, Kohberger's attorneys also argue that such defendants are unable to make a persuasive showing of mitigation in the face of prosecutorial evidence. Kohberger's defense team cites Atkins versus Virginia in the new filing, a case in which the Supreme Court prohibited executions of people with intellectual disabilities, identifying several characteristics making those defendants categorically less culpable than the average criminal. The prohibition includes those having diminished capacities to understand and process information, to communicate, to abstract from mistakes and learn from experience, to engage in logical reasoning, to control impulses, and to understand the reactions of others. But the Supreme Court has declined to review every attempt by capital defendants to extend the reach of Atkins to other developmental disorders, including autism spectrum disorder. Robert Dunham, director of the Death Penalty Policy Project, told CNN. Even if the motion doesn't succeed in barring the death penalty, Dunham sees good strategic reasons why the defense might raise the issue. Well, you always have appeal, right? It's not just because people with severe autism have the same type of adaptive deficits, have the same type of problems functioning in society that individuals with intellectual disability have. Here, there's also a reason to raise the issue because Kohberger's autism is going to affect virtually every aspect of the case, Dunham said. They want the judge to know that his autism impairs their ability to confer with him about strategy. They want the judge to know that jurors will be looking at him and his behavior and making judgments about his likely guilt or innocence. When his demeanor has nothing to do with it, it has everything instead to do with some of the off-putting behaviors that go along with autism, Dunham said. They want to educate the judge that things that should be considered reasons for life in this case may be misinterpreted as reasons for death. If the court in Idaho accepts Kohberger's motion as a valid legal argument, prosecutors have to figure out whether or not he qualifies as having ASD. Austin Surratt, a law professor at Amherst College, said. In an earlier filing, prosecutors cited a state law that stipulates mental conditions shall not be a defense to any charge of criminal conduct, except when expert evidence on the issues of any state of mind, which is an element of the offense, is introduced. Part of the problem in death cases, especially with their allegations about an intellectual disability, is to distinguish a claim that the defendant is not responsible from a claim that while the defendant is responsible, the conditions under which they acted should mitigate the punishment. And that's what I think they're doing in this, Surratt told CNN. Okay, so let me close out this picture of Bryan Kohberger, and we will wrap this video up. Tell me what you think. Tell me what you think about the ASD, the Autism Spectrum Disorder. Do you think that Bryan Kohberger has exhibited autism spectrum disorder? Do you think that this should be a reason why he should not face the death penalty if he is found guilty, or face the death penalty at all? And how do you think, or how do you feel if Bryan Kohberger does not testify and he is saying, or his defense counsel is saying it's due to the autism spectrum disorder, that because of his social and communication skills or lack thereof, we would not place him on the stand to testify on his own behalf? What do you think about it all? As I have seen this case now, it's been almost 2.5 years. Well, 2 years for sure since Bryan Kohberger's arrest, but seeing how the case has evolved, and as we're moving closer to the trial in August of 2025, I do reflect back, I think back, and when I'm learning more about this autism spectrum disorder, I would want to know a little bit more about Bryan Kohberger's childhood. I would like to know, how was he as an individual? How was he with in his peers in school? What would people say about him? What would they recount or remember about him throughout those years? Um, what would his parents say? What would his family members say? If the if the doctors are referring to family, parents, and teachers for information about the behaviors, I would want to know more information about that. Of course, I have seen some things, and I'm sure you have too. That stare, that gazing stare. Um, I think it's wise that he hasn't talked. I think it's really advisable that he does not talk, but does that impact my belief that he may have this autism spectrum disorder? I don't have enough information to say yes, I believe that. I do feel like there may be some signs. Again, the repetitive behaviors, the rocking, the washing of the hand, the idea of the cleanliness and cleaning things and wearing the gloves, possibly. But I would want to know more information, and I would want to know more so when he was much younger, because if the ASD really starts from birth, childhood through, and you can really identify by the age of 2. I would want to know, did anybody identify this? Is this a new medical diagnosis, or is this something that was diagnosed many, many years ago when Bryan Kohberger was younger? I feel like that's a fairness part, to not tie myself into a new diagnosis if I don't have the past medical history. I would just want to know more, and I would want to know if he was diagnosed, but when was that? What did teachers say? What did his peers say? His friends, if he had friends, what would his family say, and things of that matter. I think it is important because in this case, there has been so much like leakage out to the public, to the potential jury pool, and it has been very negative about Bryan Kohberger. Some of the facts of the case alleged that he was, for example, a stalker of the girls, and then we found out later that wasn't true. Um, there's a lot of things that, we're concerned about. And if we're just looking at his physical behaviors, his temperament, things like that, this would align more with the ASD, not having the facial expressions, not being emotional, things like that. But his attorneys may be able to provide more details. It appears that they are struggling or having a difficult time in the efforts of preparing for his case. They're saying, he's not really adding any value. He's not really having any input. He's processing this information very slowly. It said it's being like piecemeal to him. This is a lot of information. There's a lot of victims. The crime scene is complicated. I don't know how to feel about that, because he is someone that is educated in the area of criminal justice, just as me. But if his brain didn't develop properly, if he has mental deficiencies, and again, was there other diagnosis prior to this one? We'd have to look at that and consider that. But he was a PhD student. He does have a degree in criminal justice, criminology, social science. So we have to consider it all. And I'm wondering, is this going to be introduced as evidence on behalf of the defense? It does not appear that Bryan Kohberger is going to testify, and they're kind of saying he doesn't have the ability to testify. He doesn't have the ability to process this information. If they ask him a question, how long would it take for him to respond and process the question? Would he be able to have understanding of basic information? It could be a great struggle for him. And it may be good for him to lay this foundation if he does have and is diagnosed and has a medical history of this ASD, this autism. it could be a pivotal part of the case if he doesn't have the mental ability, you know, how his brain has developed, how he has, you know, these social issues and, you know, the inability to communicate or interact and, you know, be kind of socially awkward. It would explain some of the things that were out in the public. So please let me know, what do you think? You know, what are your thoughts about it all? Um, I, in my short opinion, I know we have the Eighth Amendment, but it's difficult for me to feel that a person is still not aware of right and wrong, even if they do have this ASD, this autism spectrum disorder. Would it rise to the level where they don't know the difference between right and wrong? Like there's a mental competency, and are they able to make decisions and know the difference between right and wrong? Can they be held legally responsible for behaviors? And not to say he did do these terrible murders. I'm not saying that, but I'm saying in general. If there is a level of autism spectrum disorder, whether you're high functioning or you have very severe um, behaviors and you're at the severe level of the spectrum, you know, can a person be held legally competent, responsible if they did do these murders? Um, it's not just the part about the Eighth Amendment and that the death penalty is cruel and unusual punishment. Can you even be held legally responsible? You know, that's something to think about. So I want to thank you for spending this time with me. I really, really appreciate it. And I'm coming next to do a video to talk about the 911 call. Please check it out. It's going to be the very next video. So I will see you soon. Bye, everybody. Stay safe, stay smart, stay savvy. Have a great day.